developed or an agricultural cover. So there's obviously still a lot to work with, but man, have we lost a lot already. So, you know, and again, the kind of, and one more step of context is, you know, there's still 2 million of our 5 million acres in the state that are unprotected and undeveloped. So clearly the situation can get worse as far as habitat loss goes. And, you know, there's just a whole bucket full of things that we've done wrong, right? Collectively as humans. You know, obviously I mentioned habitat destruction already from the previous slide, but there's sort of a cascading set of conditions that really do foster infestations of invasives. And number one on that list is overabundant deer. Number two really on that list is agricultural soil modifications. So when you look at, when we do plans for any particular piece of land, one of the first things I look at is what was the cover in 1890 and 1930. In 1890, Vermeulen mapped all the forest patches in New Jersey in the 1890s. 1930, there's the first aerial photograph. So you can say, okay, if it was never agricultural land, those forests are almost automatically going to have less invasive species in them. So we'll talk about that a little bit more too, but you know, that is a huge key underlying component for susceptibility of a piece of land to invasion. And then obviously these other altered fire regimes. I mean, Native Americans were regularly burning for many, many thousands of years, and that more or less has stopped. And obviously we also have the ability to put out wildfires. So, you know, fire regimes are completely altered. Stream flows are altered because of all that development. Habitats obviously fragmented, and I'm just now getting to global climate change. So before you even get to climate change, there's a whole slew of problems, you know, that need to be addressed to the extent we can address them. And you know, just to give you an idea of the numbers, you know, sometimes non-native and invasive get mixed in conversations, but invasives are really just a small subset of the total number of non-native plants. So estimates are out there that about 10,000 non-native plant introductions have been made. Out of those, 1,000 are established in our flora. So we have about 3,000 plants in New Jersey, about 2,000 of them are native, about 1,000 of them are non-native. And many of these are just insignificant roadside weeds and things like that. So going further down, we have 50 widespread invasive plants. So obviously that's a small number out of the 10,000. The most concerning part of this graphic is there's twice as many emerging invasive plants as there are currently widespread plants. So, you know, in the scheme of things, unfortunately, they can get significantly worse than they are now. There's just so many plants, twice as many plants that are emerging as there are widespread invasives. You know, this is pretty basic stuff, but the gist is it's a by definition, an invasive is a non-native plant that grows densely and excludes other species. And then there's obvious consequences for that and how it disturbs the food web and biodiversity. And, you know, going back to the overabundant deer issue, one of the characters that invasives have is that deer don't eat them. You know, just as a first line of defense, out of those 10,000 non-native plants and 1,000 non-native plants that are in our flora, what are the ones that sort of start to emerge as invasive species? Overriding criteria is that deer don't eat them. And then they obviously will have all of these other attributes. In addition to deer not eating them, you also have pests and pathogens that they had in their native range that didn't come with them when they were introduced here. So you have a bunch of things not eating you. You have your keystone mammal not eating you, and then you also don't have pests and pathogens eating you either, where the native species have those things. And then generally they have to have sort of the weedy characteristics. So they're tolerant to lots of different soil types, they're tolerant to a variety of light levels, and they mature quickly and produce lots of seeds. So this is sort of a weed here, and then this overriding issue with overabundant deer. And I think I've done different talks, obviously, over the years, and I don't know if this graphic helps or not, but the fundamental question is always asked and should be answered as clear as possible. Why are invasives bad? That's a fairly common question that I get in one form or another. So I just made a graphic. If you had an old field that was abandoned, certainly in our parts, autumn olive is one of the key invasives that will completely take over an abandoned piece of land. And I chose an invasive species that has as much positive attributes as I can think of. So in May, it makes a ton of flowers, tons of flowers. And they are visited by pollinators. Bees love them for sure. In September and October, they make a lot of fruit, and lots of things will eat them. Anything from a chickadee to a bear will be seen feeding on olive fruit. So what's the problem? The problem is that it simplifies the system. You might say it breaks the food web, or certainly degrades the food web. If I were a bee, I'd probably want food more than just in May. If I were a bear or a chickadee, I would probably want food more than just in September and October. So by simplifying the system, this is just a short list of things that you would have found in a successional field prior to deer overabundance. And obviously you have fruit and flowers and seeds throughout the entire year. So, we tend to not eat only in May or September, right? We need to eat all year, and all the other animals do too. So, you're basically taking a piece of a habitat and turning it into a near monoculture that excludes the production of things that would serve the full suite of biodiversity. And I'm sure all of you guys have heard about the dramatic reductions in the bird population over the last 50 years, and similar harsh reductions in the insect population where it's been measured in various locations. And obviously there's a lot of factors, like back to that slide I showed previously, but clearly this is part of the problem. You just can't take huge amounts of the food web and remove them and expect everything to be okay. And just more evidence about the timing and things like that. I think one of the things that concerns me most about invasives is the speed. From nature's point of view, this problem of invasive species is new. It's novel. In the 1950s, you could look at reports on the flora of different places in New Jersey, and the only invasive really that you would hear about is Japanese honeysuckle. Well, it's been joined by 49 more, and there's 99 more that are emerging. And you go back to even the early 80s is when stiltgrass and barberry really started to explode. So this is all relatively new, and we're hoping that our species will just instantaneously adapt, right? And clearly they're not, else we wouldn't be losing all of our birds and bugs. And if you look at the deer population, pre-European is estimated at 10 deer per square mile. We went down to zero in 1900 because of unregulated commercial deer harvesting. And by 72, we were about, 10 deer per square mile. It blew up through the 70s and 80s, 90s. And when we do our deer counts annually in Hopewell, we're getting 100 per square mile on a regular basis. There might be other parts of the state that are less, but less is still kind of relative to what it was. So great, I'm 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 plus times more deer than there should be. So, obviously that's a problem. And I don't obviously believe that it's a coincidence that invasive species surged with the deer population, or probably quickly behind them, as our forests were cleared out and lots of available resources were there, because the native species had been completely removed by deer. So just a little quick jaunt on the deer. So yeah, we did in 2022, we did have a decrease because we had the EHD, or blue tongue disease, in Hopewell. So it dropped us down to just over 70 deer per square mile. But if you look back to 2012, when there was a probably even more severe, obviously more severe reduction from EHD, a bout of EHD, the population went up pretty quickly. So I'm not expecting this to hold at 70, unfortunately. And that's still obviously 7 times more. When you look at different sources of information, that 10 starts to pop out as a magic number. There's a report from Connecticut that the Lyme disease cycle can be broken when there's so few deer. Deer vehicle collisions in healthy forests, again, are associated with 10 per square mile, in the literature as well for the forests, and all coinciding with the historic estimate of 10 deer per square mile. So things sort of, there's a number of things that sort of come together to make you think that that is the magic number. That when you get north of 10, things start to get bad. And when you're 10 times more than that, things are going to be horribly bad. So the general gist is, again, using Hopewell as an example, very fragmented forest pieces. Obviously Baldpate stands out. You're not seeing all of the Sourland Mountain stuff because only a portion of that is actually in Hopewell. But that here's a big concentration of some bigger forest. Here's a little bit bigger forest. And again, in the scheme of things, they're quite small, even by northern New Jersey standards, and certainly by Maine standards. So we have a lot of fragmentation that really makes excellent deer habitat. They like to live on the edges of these forests. They are clearly getting lots of nutrition from agricultural lands, and also from, obviously from, our landscapes themselves. And then you add that, so we've basically made it perfect for them to have their population get really big. And then you add insufficient deer management. So one of the facts about Hopewell is 40% of the land is not hunted. So if you're trying to control the deer population, you already lost 40% of the land area available to do that. And then where you do have access, for the most part, it's recreational hunting. And nothing wrong with recreational hunting, but it tends not to reduce the deer population. It tends to either maintain it or allow it to grow more slowly than it would otherwise if there was no hunting whatsoever. So add that together, and then you have all the problems that we all know and hate: Lyme disease, deer vehicle collisions, ag losses, landscape planting losses, degraded forests. So yeah, unfortunately, this is sort of, there's no way to solve the bigger issue of invasive species if this is all true. It's just going to be, holding back the tide if we don't have systems where native species can actually compete effectively because they're not getting eaten by deer. Yeah. So, when you look up in a forest and you see a canopy gap, you say, okay, well, in the good old days, that would be filled with native trees and shrubs and things like that. But nowadays, it's filled with things that are not palatable to deer. And the sort of ironic part is a canopy gap is like, a moth to a light, a deer to a canopy gap. They're sort of hardwired to know when more light resources hit the ground, more plants go there. So you basically take an overabundant deer population and you focus them on the canopy gap. So there's no way in heck an oak tree is going to make it. So, you know, that's the problem. You know, but as many negative things as I can possibly say or think or feel about how things are going, look down. There's always the possibility. You know, nature never stops trying, ever, ever, ever. When you look down, you'll see 2-3 inch tulip poplars or spice bush or whatever. And if we could just do something about the deer population, these things will get better and they will effectively compete against invasives much more than they can now. So, you know, you end up with, you know, what you want here, which you can see in certain places, you know, even obviously parts of Baldpate can look like this, not enough of it, but some. You know, other areas where there was no past agricultural use, the understory of natives is eaten and it doesn't immediately get infested by invasives because the soil is sort of holding it back. And then where you have lots of deer and past agricultural land use, you get this sort of complete forest collapse. So yeah, I mean, and that's the general state of affairs. I usually refer to this as the empty forest syndrome, and I refer to this as the infested forest syndrome. And again, it's based on deer overabundance, the combinations of deer overabundance and past agricultural land use. So emerging invasives, these are ones that have demonstrated the potential to become widespread. So that demonstration could be from a neighboring state. It could be from a small population or small infestation in some parts of the state, but the potential is there for it to become a widespread invasive species. So our technical team, every winter we meet and we reevaluate all the species we have. We think about new species that should be added to the list. And part of what we do is we say, what stage are they in? You know, so every stage has a value added value. So a stage 0 species, for example, would be less than 10 populations. A stage 3 species would be greater than 1,000 populations. And we have a phone app and we do a lot of reporting of data ourselves. And that's, you know, and EdMaps, anything that anyone reports to EdMaps gets into the larger database. But we have data that we look at and we say, how many populations are there of each of the species on our list? So obviously we focus, you know, the majority of the species on our list have less than 10 populations in the state. And then you kind of go down the list. And basically, once you've hit here, stage 2 or 3, it's generally inevitable that you're going to become a widespread invasive species. And, you know, early detection, rapid response is fairly straightforward. It's kind of as it's described. You detect it early and you respond rapidly. So sickle weed is an invasive species in rangelands and open areas in the Midwest. I got a call, this is years ago now, I got a call from someone that said, I found this thing, I think it's sickle weed. It's in White Lake, in a meadow at White Lake in Warren County. And I said, I've never heard of that before. So you do just a bit of research and you say, oh my, that would be really bad if that became established here in New Jersey. No one has ever seems to have heard of it. Even the sort of what I call the real botanists, you know, the folks that have the really good, strong botany skills. I'm somewhere below that. So it's pretty obvious what you do. You respond rapidly. So we went out and we killed it. It hasn't come back, and we have no other reports from it, you know, anywhere in the state. So by a fluke, it probably came in on machinery that was doing some work on the site. Whatever the reason was, we got rid of it as soon as we found it. And, you know, that's how you do, you know, prevention work, because obviously it's a lot easier to prevent something from happening than try to make Japanese barberry not widespread anymore. Obviously, that's not going to happen. And Japanese Spirea is another one that's tougher to handle. There's multiple populations, but every time we find it, we're very serious about getting rid of it. And it all does come down to, this sounds a little hippy dippy or whatever, but all stewardship, if there's an art to stewardship, it's knowing what to do and what not to do. Because there's so much to do, you really got to pick your battles very wisely. So like I said, you don't go trying to make Japanese barberry not widespread anymore. You stop sickle weed. So that's generally the gist of stewardship, quote unquote, wisdom. Here's another local example. This was at Baldwin Lake many years ago. Very nice meadow along the lake, and we found one mature Chinese silvergrass. So we know that this could happen. So we went and killed one plant. That's how you're sort of effective and efficient invasive species management. That's what it's about. It's knowing when you see something that, wow, that can get a lot worse if I do nothing about it. So you do something about it. And this is just a graphic describing what I've been saying all along. When you have high deer abundance and past agricultural land use, that's when you the majority of your invasives. And the reverse, when you have low deer abundance and no past agricultural use, that's when you have most of your natives. And, again, just sort of re-emphasizing with a graphic what I've been saying all along. If you're going to do effective stewardship, whether it's on your house or a preserve or whatever, the first thing you want to try to deal with is deer. And if folks want to talk about, if you have property that might be huntable, we could talk about that when we do the questions and answers. If you have invasive species, you want to start with your stage zeros first, then move on, because you want to prevent future damage. And then you can restore when you have that ability, that extra last bit of resource, if you have it at all, restoration. And the strike team has been around since 2008. We've done a lot of searching, we've done a lot of detecting, and we've done a lot of eradicating. But obviously we're proud of this accomplishment, but clearly it's easier to count invasive species than it is to get rid of them. So I expect this gap will keep getting bigger and bigger over time, although this will keep going up as well. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to talk too much about this, but we do have a new United States Forest Service grant, and we're working with private landowners, a number of them in the Sauerlands area. And we do a lot of grants and contracts, Essex County, Morris County, Jockey Hollow, Princeton. So like I said, that's sort of the kind of work we do with the strike team. And obviously we do lots of training and outreach. One thing that I want to throw out there in case anyone might be interested, we refer to them as volunteer stewardship teams, but they're basically groups of really dedicated volunteers that work on a particular piece of parkland or whatever in their own neck of the woods. So these are groups of people that said, we're going to try to do active stewardship. And probably the most premier one is the Friends of Great Swamp. There's lots of other ones too that are also very good. Watchung Reservation, Hilltop Reservation, Foots Pond, lots of others. We have web content about where these are, where the ones we know of in the state, and there's at least 15 or 20 or so. And if folks want to try to get something like this going, I'd be very happy to help in any way that I can. Because it's really, stewardship is about sustained effort. When you have sustained effort, it is inevitable that you will make progress. So it's about, biting off, taking bites that you can chew. And, when you do it that way and you say, your goal is reasonable. Each step of your goal is reasonable. You take that one bite, you chew, you move on, take another bite, et cetera, et cetera. But it is amazing some of the things these guys have done. So if anyone wants to try to start something like that, I'd be happy to point them to our website, talk to folks, put you in contact with the people that run these groups, because obviously they are a wealth of knowledge. And, just to give you some sense of hope, I've been doing a lot of work at Duke Farms for years. And we've done lots of measurements of their forests within their deer exposure and outside of their deer exposure. And outside of their deer exposure, they have the best deer management program in the state. So I'm not going to go over all this gobbledygook here, but the one way to start to think about how do things get better in a more realistic kind of way. So if you say, what's the ratio of native to non-native cover in a particular location, and you start doing stewardship work, whether that's deer management or invasive species control, hopefully both, over time, things get better, so, per year in the exposure, native species went up almost 5% per year inside the exposure. In the non-exposed area, where they just have a really good deer management program, it went up 2% per year. So, it obviously shows that things can get better over time. This, because of the way I did the measurements and I didn't take species information, there are obviously some increases in non-native cover, but it's almost exclusively multiflora rows. But I think it's sort of a perspective, the way to look at things, so you're not completely swallowed up by the problem of invasive species, is realizing that, yes, it's going to be a hard fight, but yes, it can get better when you put the effort into it. So this is, well, this could be a picture from inside or outside the exposure. They both have these types of places, but look at all these native trees in the understory. It's very rare to see that anywhere in New Jersey. You see a tiny bit of tree regeneration at Baldpate. It's mostly spice bush, which is great, but and beech, but those are native species that are very much lower on the list of palatability to deer. At Duke Farms, you can get oaks and hickories and other things that deer do tend to eat more often, maples. And again, you hear a lot of different things about, it's easy to be down in the mouth about invasives. Well, if you have stilt grass, nothing will ever grow through it. It grows so dense. Not true. These hickories are blasting right through it, only because the deer aren't eating the hickory to death. And this is probably one of my favorite pictures of all time. See the little barberry in here? Little barberry in there, little barberry down there. It's getting swallowed by native species, outcompeted and beaten down by native species. And again, look at Baldpate, you can see where you have a lot of spice bush. Oftentimes you'll find a little bit of barberry under them too, but they're not winning. The native is winning because there's enough, the deer pressure has been removed enough. Another great picture. I love it to death. Look at that barberry go down. Just getting swallowed by oak seedlings. Where else? There's not a lot of places where you can see it, say that that's happening. So I'm not going to go into control methods too deeply, other than sort of maybe focusing in on what you might do as a homeowner. But the first thing to do as a homeowner is, not buy, when you buy new plants, don't buy invasive species at all. And a lot of times people are surprised by what's on our list or angry about what's on our list. But there's 150 species that are on our list. And, there's going to be some that you've always loved for one reason or another. That's fine. We're hoping that folks will at least consider not buying new invasive species when they do new work, new plantings. So again, 150 out of about 10,000 non-natives that are out there, and many hundreds of available native species that are out there. We're asking folks to refrain from buying 150 of these widespread and emerging invasive plants. You know, it's the old cliche, but I love those kind of things. You know, like when you find yourself in a hole, you stop digging. And, you know, this represents stop digging. If we stop buying these plants, there's going to be less of an option for them to infest nearby natural areas. And, you know, for keeping in mind, again, sort of reiterating, but, you know, the most potent thing we can do to control invasive species is to allow ecological control to occur by significantly reducing the deer population. It's only then that our natural areas are going to recover. And the evidence we have from Duke Farm shows about what rate you might expect that to happen with best conditions and best deer management programs that you can get. And if you didn't memorize every number on that past slide, it was about 2% increase in native species cover per year outside of the deer exposure where they had good deer management, and they have about 25 to 30 deer per square mile there. So when you apply herbicides at home, you know, you could pretty much do what you want, which I guess is good and I guess is also bad. You don't need any particular training or anything like that if you're working at home, and the magic of the web means that you could pretty much buy any chemical you want without anyone asking you any questions like, do you know what you're doing? So, you know, obviously with caution. If you're going to use herbicides, use them with caution. And, you know, some of the basic things that we often use with the strike team, we use glyphosate as a foliar spray and a cut stump application. Same thing with triclopyramine, and then triclopyr esters, something like a Pathfinder 2. And we use that mostly for basil bark. So I can show you pictures of what all these things are. Obviously, safety is first. You don't do these things. You know, you basically, most of it's common sense, you know, but, you know, sometimes things get away from you when you're in a hurry, I guess. But, you know, you want to obviously use common sense and use protective equipment. If you're going to handle herbicides, buy nitrile gloves, the blue gloves. You don't use latex or leather gloves or dishwashing gloves or anything like that. The chemicals can go through those things. As a general rule, chemicals cannot get through nitrile. So we do foliar spraying. For safety reasons, you only do things that are 4 foot and lower, because the minute you raise your wand is the minute that wind can grab it and, you know, blow the herbicide either onto you or onto plants that you're not intending to kill. So that foliar spraying is a common option. Cut stump application is a lot more work. Obviously, you have to cut something large down, or cut it down. If it's large, it's even harder. And then you just apply herbicide to the cut stump. So the herbicide's only going exactly where you want it to go, which obviously there's not going to be any unintended effects, but it's also quite labor intensive. The basil bark application, you put your Pathfinder 2 into a sprayer and you spray it directly onto the stem all the way around, and it soaks in and kills the plant without having to cut it. So this is pretty targeted too, not quite as targeted as cut stump, but much more targeted than foliar applications. And there's all kinds of variations, hack and squirt, which is sort of obvious what that is. And one thing to keep in mind, if you are going to do any kind of herbicide applications at home, always feel free to reach out to me if you want to, my email, phone, whatever. You know, part of my job with FoHVOS and with the strike team is to answer questions. So what we did is every single species on our list has recommendations for what kind of spraying you could do or what kind of method you could do to kill it. And then we have these tables where we say, okay, here's the percentage of this and that goes into what we call foliar spray number 1. And there's a companion to this that has the exact number of ounces of each to add. So you're not putting too little in or too much in. We have done all the math for our own purposes, and then we just put it on the web, but it's available to folks if they want to do it. And maybe if folks have questions, like we'll often get asked about organic herbicides, alternate methods, and if folks have questions, I'd be happy to do that when I get done with the presentation. And yeah, so the rest of the presentation, just sort of identifying different species to think about, and hope that you'll consider these, as we do, as invasive species, despite any other attributes they have. So calorie pear, obviously, look at the picture, it's a gorgeous plant, right? In April, just filled with flowers. Over the decades, it has become a pretty bad invasive species through the Piedmont, not so much in Hopewell, but other parts of the Piedmont, entire fields covered with calorie pear. And I think one of the things I run into a lot is I think one of the key problems of invasive species and other issues is or sort of by nature, we have a human point of view, right? So we say, well, if one plant is beautiful, then why would you want 10 acres of that? It would be gorgeous. Can you imagine the entire field lit up white like that in April? And yeah, it is beautiful when that happens. But I think one of the key parts of invasive species is in the shortest amount of words possible, it's not always about us. It isn't about what pleases us. And if you're kind of defaulting, you try to say, well, what was the condition of the forest in 1492? And obviously we're never going back there again. But what makes us get farther from that, ecological health wise? And just sort of put aside our personal feelings about things and say, okay, yeah, I can recognize that calorie pear is beautiful, but I have to recognize that that's not part of our ecosystem that all the plants and all the other plants and animals evolved with over thousands and thousands of years. So we don't want this, even though it's beautiful. Other ones that commonly come across, and I might have pictures of some, if not all of them, but butterfly bush. Well, butterfly bush attracts butterflies, and I like butterflies, so I'm going to have butterfly bush in my garden. Well, it is an emerging invasive species, and I've seen large patches, infestations of it in New Jersey. We could use native species to fulfill the same roles of feeding butterflies. And then obviously we'd also want to produce larval food plants or provide larval food plants as well as nectaring plants. So calorie pear, butterfly bush, Wisteria, beautiful, beautiful plant, horribly invasive. But again, these all sort of fit into that category of someone just said, well, I like them, they look nice, or I like butterflies, so I'm gonna have butterfly bush. And it's not it's not a viewpoint that accounts for the health of our natural ecosystems. Japanese Aurelia, we've been trying to tamp this out in Hopewell for years, and every time we find one, we kill it. And if anyone sees this in Hopewell, please let us know. In other parts of the state, it's already quite widespread, but not so in Hopewell yet. This is a tough sell because it's such a beautiful plant. But yes, indeed, Japanese maple is spreading into natural areas. So yeah, as beautiful as it is, I would hope that folks would refrain from buying, at least refrain from buying new ones. Norway maple. you know, it's probably going to get worse with more climate change because it seems to be worse in urban areas. Seabold's crab, pretty much the only invasive crabapple that I'm aware of. If you see a crabapple with lots of three-lobed leaves, it's probably Seabold's. Tree of heaven, right? This is you got to respect this thing, the tree that grew in Brooklyn. But obviously, you know, quite invasive, especially with human disturbances. Some representative shrubs. So there's a group of shrubs that are worse than barberry, or have the potential. These are large, shade-tolerant species that even if you could imagine a world without a lot of deer in it, these plants would still be highly competitive with our taller native shrubs like spicebush, like black haw viburnum. So, you know, these are ones that whenever we find it, we try to get rid of as quickly as possible. But yes, please keep your eyes open for common buckthorn, or European buckthorn, it's called also. Glossy buckthorn, a relative, is highly invasive in wet areas. Obviously, your, you know, old-timey invasives that started to become invasive in the 80s. Obviously, they're quite common now. Jet bead, again, please keep your eyes open for this one too, because it is starting to rapidly accelerate after a long lag period. So we're finding more and larger populations of this across the entire state. Beautiful flowers. Lyndon Viburnum is now considered widespread, but this is also in that class of the European buckthorn, a taller shrub that even if deer were in balance, this would still have a strong competitive ability against our best native forest shrubs. Multiflora rose, it's starting to go down now from rose rosette disease, but it's still quite abundant. Oriental Photinia joins the group of Lyndon Viburnum and European buckthorn as being the most threatening, relatively new invasives. And finally, Seabold's viburnum. So again, Seabold's viburnum, Lyndon Viburnum, Oriental Photinia, European buckthorn. These are the ones that I worry about the most personally. And then you get exceptions, right? So wing burning bush, if anyone has this or has had this at their house, they know that deer do eat it. And, you know, for every rule, there's at least one exception, and, you know, wing burning bush is it. In Princeton, where they did really intensive deer management and continue to do so, their forest recovered with a common, basically a co-occurring mix of spice bush and wing burning bush after the deer herd was reduced to about 25 to 30 per square mile. So yeah, burning bush is a bit of an exception as far as the deer don't eat. But when the pressure of deer is reduced, this invasive gets much worse. So, you know, climate change, where is that coming into play? So English ivy, 30 years ago, really wasn't making fruit. It would get too cold, it would flower too late, it would make flowers too late, try to make fruit too late, and they would get frosted off and they wouldn't spread. Well, that's not true anymore. You could find English ivy popping up as seedlings in the middle of the woods anywhere in New Jersey. And if you travel to Cape May or other areas in South Jersey, you find that it is much more abundant than in North Jersey. But I could find seedlings of this in every county in the state. But it does appear to be a climate change mover. And honeysuckle, I mentioned, this is sort of the oldest, old-timey invasive where botanists were noticing this being invasive as early as the 1950s. And we mentioned Wisteria already. Obviously, it's gorgeous, ridiculous. But it does become extremely aggressively invasive. And, you know, mile a minute, another sort of recognition of how fast things can change. It just went from 6 populations to thousands and thousands of populations within 15 years or so. So annual species tend to move too fast for anyone to keep up with. When you found most bugs, when you found them, it's already too late. You can't stop them. Same thing goes for annuals and biennials. They just move too fast, have too many seeds, get around too easily, and once you found them, you're already pretty much stick a fork in you, you're done. Sad but true. You know, bittersweet is probably one through the 70s and 80s started to become much more abundant. And this is probably another climate change mover. 30 plus years ago, it was Southeast Pennsylvania, a little bit on Staten Island. Now it's extremely widespread in lots of places. Not so much in Hopewell, but soon, because there's some big populations in Princeton. And this is another one that you might not realize is invasive. Winter creeper Euonymus. So this could be a shrub or a vine, literally the same plant. It could have a shrub side and a vine side. I'd have to, it's kind of amazing. But yeah, it could also, it's evergreen. It could also go up to the tallest trees and destroy them. So this is one that's really starting to pop up. Again, I find seedlings of this in the woods all throughout the state. And we already kind of talked about Chinese silvergrass a little bit already. That one also had quite a lag time, but is now presenting itself as quite invasive. Garlic mustard, been around quite a while, relatively. Knotweed keeps getting worse and worse, especially along the Delaware River. The Department of Agriculture released a trial biological control agent last year. I don't know how it's doing yet, but fingers crossed. And stiltgrass, you know, the best, almost the only way to get rid of stiltgrass is to have a native shrub and sapling layer to shade it out. It's very difficult to control chemically. And mugwort is sort of a rising, been around a while, mostly in parking lots, and is now showing up on rocky stream sides and fields and everywhere else, unfortunately. And yeah, that's all the content I have. I'm actually looking forward to the question and answer part so I can not talk every second.
Well, good. We do have some questions. And one was actually just about stiltgrass. I think you covered it as how stiltgrass is removed, but it sounds like it's pretty much not.
Well, in a garden, in a forest, yes. In a forest, yes. It's really almost impossible. But in a garden, if you put down a couple of inches of wood chips, like in March before any possible germination has happened, you will suppress almost all of the germination. So that's one way to stop it or significantly slow it down in a garden. And then other ways are like use plants to fight it. So northern sea oats or purple giant hyssop, these are things that can get up earlier in the year than stiltgrass can germinate and get tall. So they suppress it. I've taken out swaths of stiltgrass using those plants alone. So you can outcompete it to death, you can mulch it to death, but it never, you always got to be on your toes with stiltgrass, always.
Okay, we have two related questions here, one from Pat Coleman and one from Meg Karski-Wilson about state of legislation in New Jersey to control the sale of invasives. And Meg actually pointed out she inadvertently bought winged Euonymus when looking for something called burning bush that is a native. Do you know anything about the status of legislative attempts to control the sale or spread of invasives?
Yeah, I mean, there's some movement again. There has been movement in the past. So legislation was introduced by Greenstein and Smith. It's unclear whether it'll go anywhere or not. It seems like there's a number of groups that are interested in trying to push that ball forward and encourage regulation. I mean, the saddest fact of it all is we're one of 2 states left that have no regulated list whatsoever. I mean, seriously? Really? Us in Rhode Island and everyone else has some kind of list?
That is embarrassing.
It's beyond. It is just absolutely beyond. So clearly it's high time. But we've had a very influential trade, the nursery trade, and we've had mostly disinterested representatives.
And that gets at a question that I think Heidi Moss is asking about why we don't have one. Do you think that's just the influence of the nursery trade?
Yeah, and just like I said, a serious lack from any administration to do anything about it. It's, I'm not even going to play the politics because no Republican or no Democrat has done anything. McGreevey did an executive order to start the council, Invasive Species Council. I ended up drafting the plan for them. And by the time it finally got done, it was the last 3 seconds of Governor Corzine's administration. And Governor Christie completely disbanded it and, flushed the plan down the toilet. And actually the strike team came out of that because doing the research, I realized this strike team idea is great. And it was the Forest Fish and Wildlife Service idea that I stole. And Governor Murphy has done nothing on the issue. So, here we are. No one wants to do anything about it. And we are now one of 2 states left that haven't done anything about it. And New York is probably a great model, and Pennsylvania, in their wisdom, is adopting the New York method while we do nothing. So we don't even have to, all we got to do is like cross out York and put Jersey in all of their documents and we're ready to go.
Well, perhaps some public pressure could be brought to bear. But,
yeah, for sure. It needs it. Someone needs to start paying attention.
Let's see, what do we have here? Lots of comments. Let me sort through them. Oh, here we go. Juanita asked that it's tough aster as a foliar spray option. Are there non-native invasive aster species?
I'm sorry, what kind of species?
Non-native invasive aster species.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, some of our asters are pretty weedy for sure. But I don't know of any non-native invasive asters that are around in New Jersey. Yeah, I mean, if there's a species that I don't know about, I'm sure there is, but if someone wants to send pictures or anything like that, if I can't figure out which is likely with the asters, I could send it to one of our botanists on our technical group to try to figure out what it might be, because they're good at figuring out, like, out of all the flora of the world, what might this be. So people can send me photos of it or whatever.
Yeah, and as I guess 2 related questions, Jackie Spencer asked about the yellow flowers spreading across all of our lawns, and also what resources there are for, what species are invasive and how to identify them.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the answer is lesser celandine, Ranunculus ficaria, or they keep changing the name, Ficaria verna. Same species, 2 different names. I've gotten a lot of calls over the recent years. It does, very good guess would be that it's spreading in, landscapers' mowing equipment. And there's an inordinate amount of new lawn infestations of it. So I'm thinking that it's getting carried around in equipment and spread from one place to another. And trying to unscramble that egg would be very hard, but you'd have to basically use an herbicide that can only kill broadleaf plants and apply it early in the year if you wanted to get it out of your lawn. But it seems that landscaper, companies are carrying it around all over the place.
We have 2 related questions where answers may help, which may help answer each other. Ann Christensen asked that if you know of any organizations, hunting organizations that she could contact. She's interested in opening up her property to hunting. And relatedly, Meg Karski Wilson asked if there's a place to connect people with huntable lands to hunters who want a location to hunt, and she wanted her team to get involved.
Okay. So if anyone wants to, I could connect folks with hunters. You know, normally if people ask me, you know, do you know someone? What I do is I'll say to the landowner who asks, I'll say, here are names of a few hunters, and you could reach out to them. You know, and you know, usually I'll do it that way. I have the safety zones for the entirety of Hopewell Township mapped out. So if you gave me your address, I can spit you out a map that shows you whether your land is huntable or not within safety zones of your neighbors. So we have that. And I feel like I forgot one part of the question already. Oh, connecting people. You know, we tried something called the Hunter Connection years ago with Jen Rogers and Sauerland Conservancy. And we got lots of hunters that were interested in finding places to hunt and no landowners that were interested in providing places to hunt. So we kind of scrapped that idea. But if any individual person wants to have hunting on their property, please reach out and I'll try to work with you to connect you to someone.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if maybe it's time to revisit that if the attitudes are changing from landowners' points of view. Fairfax asked about the jumping worms in Hopewell and if anything can be done to remove them. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think there's a practical way at any scale to get rid of them. You know, I mean, folks might know, but all the worms that we're seeing are all non-native. They're either European or Asian species. None of our worms they're slow movers. None of them have returned from the last glaciation 15,000 years ago. So, you know, every single worm we see is non-native, and they've had dramatic impacts. And the jumping worm is the latest and also quite destructive species of earthworms. But, you know, there's different, you know, kind of homemade kind of things you could try to do. But I really don't think there's a real practical way to get rid of them that I'm aware of. You know, what I would suggest is, you know, try to sort of counterbalance them to the extent you can. So they destroy the leaf litter, you know, try to, especially around gardens and any other parts of your property where you can get, you know, put raw wood chips down, you know, do things like that to try to rebuild that organic matter. And obviously they can't break down wood chips too easily, but just try to return some organic that they're stripping away.
Okay, time for a question, one or two more questions. June Schwank asked if privet hedges are invasive, and they're wondering what kind of native tree would do well in full sun with compact soil in Hopewell Borough, so more of a suburban situation than
to replace privet?
A native situation. She didn't say specifically, but she's wondering if they were invasive. But she's also asking about what tree she might put in.
There's a lot of different privet species. There's a couple that are pretty common as invasives. So yeah, I think the short answer is yes, they're invasive. If it's about trying to replace privet with something, you know, you might consider something like bayberry if you have full sun. You know, that's something that deer don't eat and can be shaped into a hedge just like privet can be. You can square it off or do whatever you want. It's pretty amenable to that. I've seen lots of examples of bayberry trimmed like a privet. And it is naturally occurring in Hopewell bayberry. You know, as far as trees for full sun, I mean, I think, you know, it's more or less the sky's the limit. You know, there's pretty much any native tree will do good in that. Compacted soils, yeah, that's harder. But if you're nice enough to the plant, I think just about anything will establish tree-wise.
Okay, and she had a final question. I think we can probably end the questions after this one. She asked if Pachysandra was native and if there are any native evergreen ground covers. Further up, Juanita actually mentioned she was doing an experiment with native pachysandras. So I guess the answer to that question is yes. But so
Yep.
is it an effective evergreen ground cover? And if not, what else are some options?
I'd be curious what Juanita found about the native pachysandra, because I've never really done much with it, but I don't know if that's effective or not as a evergreen ground cover. But as far as other possibilities, I mean, you could do, you know, evergreen is hard. I don't think there's anything quite like Vinca or pachysandra, unless Juanita has a story about the native pachysandra and how well that might do. But you know, I think there's other things that sort of we open sort of our idea of it up a bit, but as far as evergreen glossy leaves all winter, that's a hard sell for a native. There's not really going to be anything that's going to quite fit that role, but you know, you could use foam flower, or you know, obviously that's going to be deciduous or some sort of evergreen but flattens out. You know, there's definitely other choices that, but it is, nothing is going to be quite like pachysandra as far as I know, the Japanese pachysandra. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike. Just as a reminder to everyone, I'm going to put the information about our walk with Mike back in the chat, since it's gotten displaced by everyone's excellent questions. If you're interested in the walk that's being held on October 1st at 2 p.m. at Baldpate in Hopewell Township, please email the contact.wcas@gmail address that I've just entered into the chat. And that's a little more information about the walk from before. Thank you so much for your talk, Mike, and thank you for the walk that you're willing to lead. Meg, I did drop the information about the walk into the chat. We can leave it up there for a little while. Oh, you're right, because I didn't do it to everyone. Got me. Thanks for letting me know. There we go. Now everyone should be able to see it. Okay. Oh, and we will get an email out to you as well from the list that we have from the registration. That's one of the reasons we like doing the registrations, is that it lets us know who's attending and lets us contact you about these special opportunities. So do visit our website. Soon we'll have links to registrations for our October field trips that are coming up, October and November field trips that are coming up. And we will have information up there soon about our October public program meeting, where Sharon McGee will talk about her visit to the Pantanal in Brazil. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. I hope you folks who get to attend the walk can make it out. And thanks again to Mike for the talk and the walk. I hope everybody has a good night and a good month, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Good night, Mike.
Bye-bye.